What's up everybody, welcome back. Johnny B here with Devslopes.com, and we are continuing on with our Legend of Devslopes game, and it is shaping up to be a pretty cool game indeed. And I'm sure you've been wondering, when are we going to work with our ranger? You know, he's just been kind of hanging out, he just walks around, follows us, but he doesn't attack yet. And that is what we are going to work on in this video, alright? So, what do we want? Let's think about how we want him to behave. So right now, he follows us right up to our position, and then he does his attack animation. I'm thinking that a crossbowman like this would only come within a certain distance, and then he would stay at that distance while he attacks us, while he shoots his arrows at us. So what we're going to do is we're going to modify his nav mesh agent. So with the rangers selected, come over here and to his nav mesh agent component, and we are going to put in a stopping distance of 10, which is equal to his range. And then here in his enemy attack script, let's also change his range to 10 so that his stopping distance and his range are the same. Let's press apply. And let's just see what that does. Alright, so if we go beyond 10, okay, so he starts coming out at us, and then at 10, he stops, shoots, but then he goes into his walking animation. So that's not quite what we want, right? So I'm thinking when he reaches his, when he reaches the range and starts shooting, he'll just go back to idle after he shoots. So we're going to need to modify our animator controller. So with our ranger selected, go ahead and open the animator controller window. And so what we're going to do is, instead of going directly from attack to walk, we are going to actually do a check to see if we're in range. And if we're in range, we're going to go to idle. And from idle, we'll do a check to see if we're in range, and if we're not in range, then we'll go back to walk, okay? So I'm gonna make a couple of transitions, but first I'm gonna make a parameter. So I'm gonna say make a parameter, and it's gonna be a bool, and we're going to call it player in range, okay? And we're going to do a check after the if we're in range, we are going to transition to idle. So I made a transition from attack to idle, and the transition condition is going to be, we're going to add it here, conditions, click on the plus and select player in range, and that's true. So if our player is in range to attack us, we're going to go back into the idle after the attack until our next attack. But if we finish idle and we are no longer in range, then we're going to transition back to walk, and that condition is going to be player in range is equal to false. Okay, just to get this a little bit bigger. Okay, so does that make sense? Whenever we're in range, we play the attack, but if we are still in range, instead of going back to walk, we're going to go to idle. And if during the time that we are in idle, we move out of the enemy's range, then we'll go back to walk, okay? So I like that, that looks good, we're gonna save that. But we don't have any code to set these bools, right? So we're gonna need a new script that, that will be the ranger attack script. So right now, if we look at our enemy, at our ranger, we have an enemy attack script. So we have our enemy attack script attached to our ranger, and we are going to base our ranger attack script off of it. We could do some inheritance, but the ranger attack script is going to change stuff in pretty much every function anyways. So we would be overriding pretty much every function and changing and adding stuff. So it doesn't make a lot of sense to do inheritance right here. We're just going to copy it and modify it based on the enemy attack script. So back in scripts, I'm going to right click and say create C# script. I'm going to call this a ranger attack. Okay, and then I'm going to open that up. And from the enemy attack, I have selected everything and copied it. And in ranger attack, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to paste everything. And I'm just going to change the public class name to ranger attack again to match the name of the file that we created. Okay, so what do we need to change in our ranger attack script? Well, we don't need our weapon. We don't need a reference to our weapon colliders because the ranger doesn't have any melee weapons. So we can get rid of that. We can get rid of the reference to it in start. And we don't need these enemy begin attack and enemy end attack functions. The coroutine for attack can stay. And I think this will be a good place to start with our script. So let's save it. Go back to our Unity editor, select our ranger. We are going to remove the enemy attack script. Let's say remove component, and we are going to add component. And the script we are going to add is, so had a small typo right here with the public class name, should be ranger attack. And then back in our Unity editor, under the ranger, we're going to add component, and the script we are going to add is ranger attack. We're going to change the range back again to 10. And let's go ahead and run that just to make sure we're looking okay so far. And what we should expect to see is that when he is in range, he goes back to idle, but we are seeing that he is still walking, so he's flowing straight from attack back to walk. And I think I know the reason why. So if we select this transition from attack to walk, we forgot to put a condition on it. So the condition here also needs to be player in range is equal to false. So let's try that one more time. Okay, so we are attacking, and while in range, we go back to idle here. And then once we move out of range, then we transition to walking. Okay, great. Then we attack, and while we're still in range, we go back to idle. Okay, perfect. That looks real good. But our next issue that we need to fix is, look, we can get right behind him, and he's not turning. He's just shooting in the same direction as when he paused. And we can just kill him. Die, die, die. Okay, so that's not very fair. We need to be able to make this so that he can rotate towards us at any point during gameplay. So to fix the rotation problem, let's go ahead and open up our ranger attack script again. And we are going to create a function that when the player is in range, he will let him rotate towards the player. Okay, so what we're going to do is we are going to create a function called private void, and we're going to call it rotate towards, and we're going to pass into it a transform that we are calling player. And so what do we need to do? First we need a direction to look towards. So we're going to create a vector 3, and we are going to call it direction, and that is going to be equal to the player dot position minus the transform dot position. So the hero's position minus the enemy ranger position, and then we're going to normalize that. Okay. And then we need to create a quaternion, that fun word again, for our rotations. We're going to say quaternion, and we're going to call that look rotation, and that is equal to quaternion dot look rotation, and look rotation creates a rotation with the specified forward and upwards directions. So look rotation, and we are setting that, and we're going to pass in the direction vector that we just created. And lastly, we do the actual rotation. So we're going to say transform we're grabbing the transform of our enemy ranger, and we're going to set the rotation equal to the quaternion, and we're going to use slurp, which is a spherically interpolation between two quaternions. And so we're going to say transform dot rotation. So we're going to go from our current rotation to the look rotation that we created just above, and we're going to do that by time dot delta time, and we're going to multiply that by about 10f, and that will control how quickly the enemy ranger is able to rotate and look at us. We can adjust that later as needed. And so let's save that. Just run through that one more time. We are creating a direction towards the player. Then we are creating a quaternion rotation called look rotation. And then we are performing the rotation using the quaternion slurp and passing in the enemy's current rotation and where we want it to look, and then our measurement of how fast it will rotate towards us. Let's go ahead and save that and come back over into our Unity editor. So let's go ahead and play that and see if it is working. Let's check out our animator window. And nothing's happening. We forgot to actually implement it. So we created the function, but we need to call it. So here in the update, when the player is in range, we are going to say rotate towards, then we need to pass in a transform. So we want to pass in player, which is a game object. So then we say player dot transform. Okay, there we go. So now that should work. Let's run back over here to Unity, press play. And while in range, he is rotating towards us, so that looks great. Now let's see if we come away from him. He starts moving towards us. Then when he's in range, stops and shoots and continues to rotate towards us. So that is fantastic. So that's exactly the behavior that we are looking for. All right, that looks good. So now I think we're ready to actually start shooting arrows. So what we're going to do is we're going to use an animation event again so that we get the firing action at the right time that corresponds to the animation. So down here in models, we are going to open our ranger and look at our attack. And we're going to edit it. We're going to scroll down here to the events. We're going to click on the plus sign to create a new event. And we are going to call that fire arrow. Okay, that's good. And let's see where we want that to occur. So let me just make this a little bit bigger. Right, I think about, so he fires and he's got some recoil. So I think right at the beginning of the recoil, frame 25 is where we are going to set our fire arrow event to. All right, so I've drug the fire arrow event to that position at frame 25. Okay, then press apply, and that looks good. All right, so now what we are going to do is let's run back, open back up our ranger attack, and we're going to create a function that will be called when that animation event occurs. So we're going to say public void fire arrow is the name of the event animation, the animation event. And what are we going to do when we fire an arrow? We are going to first create an arrow. We are going to then set the position to a specific location. Then we need to set the orientation of the arrow so that it's shooting towards the hero. And then we need to apply a velocity to it. So those are the steps that we're going to do inside here and the fire arrow function. But first, let's get our arrow ready to be instantiated, because right now we don't actually have it set up yet. So let's scroll up to the top and create a reference to an arrow. So we're going to say private game object arrow. And then on start, well, first what we're going to do So let's go ahead and import our arrow model into our Unity editor. So let's go back to Unity and open up your assets folder and find the folder that says arrow. And what we're going to do is we are going to drag in the arrow.fbx into models. And then back to our assets folder, we're going to drag arrow.mat into the materials folder and arrow.png into the textures folder. And then back in Unity, open your scene window, and I'm going to drag an arrow into the scene. I pressed F to zoom in on it. And so there it is. And it looks like we accidentally already had one. So let's delete this, and then drag that arrow back into the scene again. Okay, so here we have our arrow, and we need to apply some texture to it. So here we're going to say arrow, come to the model, and here under the shader, here we need to select our albedo, which is going to be called arrow. There we go. And the shader that we want is mobile and diffuse. Okay, so there is our arrow. Looks good. And I think it's a little bit too thin. So we are going to, well, first we're going to make this a prefab. So from your hierarchy, drag that arrow into your... All right, so now we have an arrow prefab, and for us to be able to shoot it, we need to have a rigid body. So I'm going to add a component and say rigid body. Whoops, and then I accidentally clicked on receive shadows. So rigid body, and then we'll just start there for now. And let's go ahead and come back to our Ranger attack script. And with prefabs, we can't just add a serialized field referencing a prefab. So what we're going to do is our game manager is actually going to hold the reference to our arrow. So here I'm going to copy this and create a new serialized field, and the game object is going to be arrow. Okay, so I'm going to save it. Then we're going to jump back into our Unity editor, grab our game manager, and now we have a slot for arrow. So I'm going to drag in our prefab arrow. All right, so that's good. So now our game manager has a reference to the arrow, and then back in our Ranger attack script, we have created we need to create a private reference to the arrow. So private game object of type arrow. And in start, we are going to say arrow is equal to game manager.instance dot, and we need to have a getter for our arrow. So back in game manager, we're going to we'll just copy this here and create our getter for our arrow, private game object called arrow, and we're going to return lowercase arrow. Okay, so now we have a public getter that we can add to our Ranger attack. So arrow is equal to game manager.instance.arrow. All right, there we go. So now we're finally ready to come back down here into our fire arrow function and fill that up. So what we're going to need to do, like I said, we're going to first instantiate it. So I'm going to say game object new arrow is equal to an instantiate arrow as, now we're casting it as a game object. Okay, so now we need some place for the arrow to spawn from. We need to set its position. And we could just say transform.position, but that would spawn it right at its feet at 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0 of the ranger. So I think something better would be if we create a serialized field inside of our ranger attack script. And so we're going to create a serialized field that is going to be of type transform. And we're going to call this fire location. Okay. And then I'm going to save it. And we're going to go fill in that fire location slot now. So in our ranger attack script, we should see, okay, so now we have a slot for fire location. And I think what we want is if we expand completely our ranger game object, down here at the bottom, close to the bottom, we have orc ranger bow. And I'm going to press F in our scene to move to it. And so if we, let's make the orc ranger bow the location of firing. That way it'll look realistic. The arrow will spawn right at the correct location. And I think that would be good. So with our ranger selected, and here in our ranger attack script, go ahead and grab the orc ranger bow and drag that into fire location. All right, so that looks good. Then back in our ranger attack script, what we're going to do is we are going to position our new arrow at the location that we just defined. So new arrow.transform.position is equal to fire location dot position. All right, so that looks good. Now, whenever it is instantiated, it's going to spawn right at that point. All right, next up we have new arrow. So now we are going to set the rotation to what we want it to be, which would be forward in the direction of our firing. So we're going to say transform dot rotation is equal to transform, which is the enemy, which is the ranger's rotation, and we're going to set it equal to that. And then all we need to do left is say new arrow dot get component. We're going to grab its rigid body because the rigid body is what we need to set the velocity. So I'm going to say velocity is equal to transform dot forward. So we're going to set it in the forward direction. And let's try about 25 for the speed. Okay, so I'm going to save that. And let's see if that works. So I'm going to come back in here, move this up, and I'm going to press play. All right, so that's interesting. We are shooting, but we're just adding a whole bunch of arrows right here. It doesn't look like we're getting the forward direction. Okay, so let's see what is going on with this. And I think, let's see here, arrow, rigid body. I think I didn't apply the changes to the arrow. So let's go ahead and say apply. And let's give that another try. There we go. So you can see that they are shooting at us, but the rotation is not working. And that's actually expected. When I was working through this the first time, what I found out was that the arrow has a default orientation that is about 90 degrees off of the world location. So what we're going to do is we're going to backtrack a little bit and show you the right way of doing this. Okay, so I'm going to delete the arrow from our scene, and I'm going to create a new empty object. And this empty game object I'm going to call arrow prefab. Okay, and then inside of the arrow prefab, I'm going to drag, or as a child of the arrow prefab, I'm going to drag the arrow model onto the arrow prefab. Okay, so now we have an empty game object called arrow prefab and the model arrow inside of it. Okay, and so our arrow prefab, we are going to add a component to it, and we're going to add a rigid body, and we're going to save that. In the prefabs folder, I'm going to delete the old arrow prefab. So I'm going to delete it. And then I'm going to drag the new arrow prefab that is inside our scene hierarchy into the prefabs folder. And let's take a look at this arrow. Okay. And so, like I said before, one of the reasons that we were getting a misaligned orientation on our arrow, so choose the child arrow and set a rotation of 90 degrees to it. Okay, save that, apply, and that should do it. So I'm going to press, so we need to reassign our slot for the arrow in our game manager. So I'm going to select our game manager and then grab our arrow prefab and drag it into arrow and save it, and let's run that and see how it goes. Okay, great. So now we can see that the enemy is rotating and shooting at us. The arrow is shooting right at us in the correct orientation, and that is looking pretty darn cool. One thing, the arrow is pretty small. It's difficult to see. So let's go ahead and pause this, and I'm going to come down here to our arrow prefab in the child arrow, and let's go ahead and just make it a little bit bigger. Okay, so I'm gonna, with the arrow selected in the scene hovering, I'm gonna press F, and let's modify this a little bit. So I'm going to say in the Y direction, let's try 1, and in the Z direction 0.75, and that just makes it a little bit more beefy. So I'm going to press apply, and let's give that one more go. Yeah, that's a little bit easier to see. All right, so awesome. We are shooting arrows at our player. So what's the next step? We need to register that the arrow is hitting the player. And I think we also want the arrow to disappear when it hits us, okay? I think what we're going to need to do is actually have 2 box colliders. One box collider, which will be the trigger, which we use in our player health. So our player health is looking for trigger colliders. And then we're going to need a second box collider that will register the collision with the player, okay? And so we're going to have a script that is a component on the arrow itself that registers when it collides with an object. And when it collides with an object, it will kill itself. It will destroy itself. Okay, so that's why we're going to need 2 box colliders. So on our arrow prefab, the parent, let's go ahead and add a component. We're going to say box collider, and that is way too big. So let's shrink it down. I'm thinking in the size of the X 0.1, Y 0.1, and the distance is fine, maybe a little bit shorter, 0.7, that looks good. All right, so we have a box collider here, and we already have our rigid body, and we don't want to use gravity, so no gravity. We're not going to have it fall and sink down. It's just going to shoot straight as an arrow, right? All right, so that looks good. And whoops, I accidentally added those back. We don't want gravity or it to be kinematic. And then for our child arrow, we are also going to need a box collider and a rigid body. However, our rigid body doesn't use gravity, and for our child, it's kinematic, which means that the physics won't be acting on it. And and our box collider on our child is a trigger. So this is the collider that is going to actually trigger the take hit on the player health, okay? And our box collider looks a little bit big here, so let's go ahead and shrink that a little bit in the, what is that, the Z direction? 0.1, okay, that looks better. 0.1, okay, so, oops, all right, there we go. Okay, all right, that works. Okay, so remember in our player health script, we look for triggers that are tagged with weapon. So we are tagging our arrow with the tag of weapon, and we can go ahead and tag the parent object as well as weapon. And let's see if the player registers this hit. So make sure that you apply the changes that we've just made and press play. All right. So we are definitely registering the hits. One thing you'll see is that it's only every other shot that hurts us, and that's because the ranger fires every 1 second, and we have that time between hits variable of 2 seconds. And so if it's within those 2 seconds and we get hit by another arrow, it's just gonna currently bounces off. In a second, we are about to write the script that will delete or destroy the game object. All right. So let's go ahead and write that script right now. So that's going to be on our parent arrow prefab. We're going to add a component, and that component is going to be a new script called arrow. Okay, so I'm going to open that up. And all we need this script to do is destroy itself. So we don't need anything but this simple function. Void on collision enter. And we are looking for a collision. And it can be called call, doesn't matter because we're not actually going to be using it. And we just say destroy game object. Okay, and then press save. And let's come back over here to our Unity editor and press apply on our prefab to save the changes to all of the new arrows that are going to be instantiated. And let's see how this goes. So you'll see that we are no longer having arrows shot out. And I believe that is because we have a physics layers problem. And so the moment that it is instantiated, it is directly in contact with a portion of our ranger itself, okay? And so what we need to do is implement some layers. So on our arrow prefab, for the parent, we are going to say layer, and we're going to add a layer. And this layer we're going to call arrow. And then we're going to create another layer called enemy. So we're creating these two layers, and on our arrow prefab, we are going to set the layer to arrow. And yes, change children. And then on our ranger, we are going to set the layer to enemy. Okay. And let's try just this object only. No, let's say yes, change children. And then we go up here to edit and project settings and physics. So what we've done is we've assigned two layers. We assigned a layer to the arrow and a layer to the enemy. And what we can do here in this physics inspector, we have this array of layers. And so what we can do essentially is say, I want the arrow to ignore any physics object that has the layer of enemy. Okay, so it's going to pass through any object with the layer enemy, but anything else, whether it's a box collider wall, one of our houses, one of the, anything else, a tree, then it counts that collision, okay? So here on enemy, this enemy column, we are going to, or I should say on the arrow row, we are going to deselect the enemy layer, okay? Then I'm going to press save and run it again and see if that does it for us. All right, so now we got the arrows shooting out at us. They are destroying themselves when they hit us, but now we're not registering a hit. So let's see what's going on with that. Okay, I think I made a change in the arrow prefab without applying the change, so I'm going to press apply, and then press play again and see if that fixes it. Okay, so, okay, there we go. Awesome. All right, so our ranger is shooting at us. We take the hit. It destroys the game object when it hits us, or so you can see down here, when it misses us and hits the collider wall, then it is also destroyed. And so that is just what we want. All right, so this looks great. And then we can fight him, let's kill him. And we have another one coming, but he is not shooting arrows at us, and that's because we need to apply our changes to our ranger to the prefab. So with the ranger selected, I'm going to press apply. And I also noticed something. I'll show you again real quick. When we kill him and we move around, look, he's still rotating towards us. So we need a check inside of our ranger attack script. So just pulling that back open. So rotate towards. Here in the range, we can add just one more check. Say and enemy health dot is alive. So we gotta also be alive for us to rotate towards the enemy. And that looks good. So let's just make sure that that's fixed. So playing one more time. And if we kill him, he dies and he's no longer rotating towards us. So that's great. Okay, what is this? We have ranger animation event. Enemy and attack has no receiver. Okay, so let's see what that's about. Okay, so this was when we were applying the enemy and attack to our model animations, and we did it for the tanker and the soldier, so that when they were hurt, they couldn't attack us. But we don't really need that for the ranger animation. So I'm going to go ahead and open up the animation for hurt, edit it, come down here to our events, and select the enemy and attack and press delete and apply. And then for the die animation as well, edit, come down to the events, select it, and press delete, and then press apply. All right, go ahead and save that, run it one more time, make sure we're not getting any errors. All right, so we are totally error-free. We are killing our rangers. Everything is working as expected. Okay, so we got a couple of more bad guys here. Let's kill them and see if we can get some rangers to spawn. Okay, so here's a newly spawned ranger. Let's see if he stops and shoots at us. And he does. We got the arrows coming at us while we're fighting this soldier. Oh man, this definitely adds a very cool aspect to the game. You know, before we were just fighting our melee guys, but now we gotta be, watching our back, making sure we don't got any rangers shooting arrows at us. So I'll pause that and I'll play it a little bit later. But you guys, we have just done some very cool stuff. We have created some scripts to control our ranger in attack mode so that he creates new arrows to shoot at us. We have him turning towards us. We have him controlling his range of when he shoots at us and how far he'll come. and then we destroy the arrows when they collide with us or with the collider walls. And I think that is coming along just how we want it. I'm going to delete these arrow prefabs that we have in the scene. So I'm going to say delete. And for the ranger, I'm going to apply changes, and then I'm going to disable him here. And I think that's all we want to cover here in this video. And I hope you guys are having fun with this. Play it, check out your new ranger shooting arrows at you, and see if you can get to level 20. And I'll see you in the next one.